Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're about to plunge into a stack of sources that explore one of the most endlessly fascinating and often surprising topics out there, the psychology of money. What really drives our financial decisions? Why do seemingly smart people look at money and see things so dramatically differently? That's the core question we're tackling today.
Exactly. And the material for this deep dive, it comes from excerpts of a book that really stands out because it blends classic finance with behavioral psychology and even a bit of history. Gives us a pretty unique lens. Our mission here, really, is to pull out the most potent nuggets of insight from this stuff. We want to help you understand not just your own relationship with money, but maybe why people around you do what they do. We'll look at why something that seems completely irrational to one person makes, well, perfect sense to another. We'll explore that often confused difference between being rich and being wealthy.
That's a big one.
Huge. And uncover the surprising power of just simple saving.
Yeah.
And maybe see why, in finance especially, a good story often carries more weight than cold, hard stats.
Okay, sounds great. Let's unpack this together and see what we find. So, right off the bat, one of the most powerful ideas this material presents is that, well, when it comes to money, no one is crazy. People do things that look absolutely wild, maybe, from the outside.
Definitely.
But the argument here is that those decisions, they make perfect sense to them. It's all based on their own unique history, their experiences.
That's the crucial starting point, yeah. And it explains why this happens, right? People are products of their environment, their generation, their specific economic experiences, even just dumb luck sometimes. All these things teach wildly different lessons about money. What really struck me in the source is this statistic, or maybe it's more of an idea, that your personal experiences, even though they're a tiny, tiny fraction of everything that's ever happened, like 0.000000000%, they say they can actually make up maybe 80% of how you think the world works.
Wow, 80% from that tiny slice.
Yeah, which is why, equally smart people can look at the exact same financial situation, the same data, and draw completely opposite conclusions.
It makes total sense when you frame it like that. The source gives some powerful examples too, like if you grew up experiencing real poverty, your view on risk and reward is just fundamentally different from someone who grew up, say, in a wealthy banking family. You've got a completely different baseline.
Absolutely. Or imagine growing up during a period of really high inflation versus growing up when prices were stable. Those are two completely different economic boot camps, basically.
Right. Or think about the stockbroker who lost everything in the Great Depression compared to, I don't know, a tech worker riding the dot-com boom in the late 90s.
Worlds apart, totally different lessons learned. Even the example they use of someone in Australia, which, when this was written, hadn't seen a recession in like 30 years?
30 years.
Yeah. Their sort of economic DNA is just different than an American who lived through, say, 2000 or 2008.
And the material really hammers this point home. You can read all the history books you want, you can study the charts, but that doesn't truly replicate the emotional scar tissue of actually living through a crisis. A spreadsheet shows a market drop, sure, but it doesn't show that feeling, that pit in your stomach, wondering if a mistake you made will hurt your kid's future.
Exactly. Studying history gives you the intellectual grasp, maybe, but you might not get the real behavioral change until you feel that uncertainty, that fear, yourself.
This brings us to a really surprising example they use. Lottery tickets.
Yeah, the lottery ticket.
The material points out that Americans spend more on lottery tickets than on movies, video games, music, sports, and books combined.
It's staggering when you hear it like that.
And the bulk of that spending comes from lower-income households.
Right.
Like 4 times more on average than higher-income households spend.
Which feels so backwards, right? Especially when you hear stats like, 40% of Americans can't cover a $400 emergency.
Exactly. So why would someone struggling spend, over $400 a year on lottery tickets? It seems illogical.
And this is where the source really pushes us to look beyond just the math, beyond the spreadsheet logic, and try to understand the motivation. The perspective they offer is that for many people in that situation, they're not just buying a piece of paper. They're buying a dream.
Buying a dream.
Yeah. It might be the only affordable way for them to hold on to a tangible fantasy of getting the good stuff, the things others maybe take for granted because they're already living, in a way, a version of that dream.
So while buying lottery tickets when you're broke might be, objectively, a bad financial move.
Sure, mathematically.
The source helps you understand the reasoning. You see the why. once you consider the person's context, their hopes, maybe their lack of other avenues for that feeling.
Right. It just reinforces that very few financial decisions are purely analytical. They're all tangled up with our personal history, our ego, pride, marketing influences, weird incentives. It all gets scrambled together into the story we tell ourselves about money.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. Let's move to another area where money gets really complicated and presents some deep ironies. This part is fascinating. It's the whole idea of having enough.
Oh, enough. Yeah. There's that fantastic story in the source about a party hosted by some billionaire. Kurt Vonnegut is there with Joseph Heller.
The author of Catch 22.
Right. And Vonnegut points out to Heller, you know, our host probably made more money today than you've earned from Catch 22 in its entire history.
Wow.
And Heller's reply is just perfect. He says, yes, but I have something he will never have. Vonnegut asks what? Heller says, enough.
Enough. Just that one word.
Yeah.
Powerful.
So powerful because it highlights this core challenge, right? The source shares that cautionary tale of Rajat Gupta.
Former head of McKinsey, right? Hugely successful guy.
Immensely successful, worth reportedly $100 million, sat on major corporate boards, partnered with Bill Gates on philanthropy. I mean, the pinnacle of success by almost any measure, and yet he risked all of it. His reputation, his freedom, obviously the wealth he already had, for what turned out to be a relatively tiny game, like $1 million, through insider trading, ended up convicted, went to prison.
It just seems baffling from the outside. $100 million wasn't enough. What's the key lesson the source draws from stories like that?
It's pretty stark, actually. They state it very clearly. There is no reason to risk what you have and need for what you don't have and don't need.
Simple, but profound. And this isn't just a billionaire problem, is it? The source makes the point that most people, if they have a decent career, will probably reach a point where they earn enough to cover their reasonable needs, maybe many of their wants.
Right.
The hardest financial skill, according to this material, might just be getting that goalpost to stop moving.
Exactly right. Because if your expectations just keep ratcheting up every time your income does, you always feel like you're falling behind, even if you're objectively doing great.
Yeah, you never quite arrive.
Never. And that feeling, that constant comparison, can push you to take bigger and bigger risks just trying to keep up. Capitalism, the source notes, is amazing at generating wealth, but it's maybe even better at generating envy.
So true.
Having that internal sense of enough is just critical for happiness. They even offer a simple equation. Happiness equals results minus expectations. If your expectations keep outpacing your results, you're setting yourself up for disappointment.
And that inability to just say no to chasing one more dollar, regardless of the potential cost.
Yeah, that can lead to serious regret, or like with Gupta, or obviously someone like Bernie Madoff, it can lead to absolute ruin. The material really emphasizes there are just some things, reputation, freedom, family, friends, that are never worth risking, no matter the potential upside. Gupta himself apparently said something profound after prison. Something like, the big lesson was, don't get too attached to anything.
Yeah.
Which is quite a takeaway.
Wow. Okay, let's pivot now from the traps of chasing more to maybe one of the most, almost magical forces in finance, compounding.
Yes. Compounding.
Yeah, that incredible idea that, a relatively small starting point, if you add consistent growth over a really, really long time, can lead to results that are just extraordinary.
It really is mind-bending when you see it play out. And the classic example, of course, is Warren Buffett.
Yeah.
And what this material highlights so well is that his massive fortune isn't just because he's a brilliant investor, though he obviously is. Plenty of people have generated high returns for periods. Buffett's secret weapon is that he's been a good investor since he was literally a child. It's the longevity. Starting so young, staying consistent for, 8 decades now? That's what allowed compounding to perform its, almost unbelievable magic.
Which leads directly to another really critical distinction the source makes. Getting wealthy is one skill, but staying wealthy, that's a completely different skill set, and often it's much, much harder.
So true. They tell these fascinating parallel stories from the 1929 crash. You have Jesse Livermore, the legendary trader who made an absolute fortune betting against the market going into the crash.
Right, the Great Bear.
Exactly. And then you have someone like Abraham Dermansky, a very wealthy real estate developer at the time who was completely wiped out by the crash.
Okay.
But here's the twist. Fast forward a few years, Livermore, kind of high on his 1929 success, gets increasingly aggressive, takes on massive amounts of debt, makes bigger and bigger bets, and loses everything. Tragically, he ends up taking his own life.
Oh, wow.
Jermansky, meanwhile, the guy who was ruined, he apparently rebuilt his fortune. So both were clearly skilled at getting wealthy initially, but Livermore lacked that crucial second skill, staying wealthy.
So when you look at someone like Buffett through this lens, the material doesn't just focus on his wins. It highlights his survival traits, often framed by what he didn't do.
Exactly. He didn't use excessive debt. He didn't panic and sell during the big downturns. He didn't tarnish his reputation. He didn't become rigid in his thinking or strategy. He didn't rely too heavily on other people's money, which can disappear at the worst times. He didn't burn himself out. Survival is the key. Survival equals longevity, and longevity is what unlocks the real power of compounding.
There's also that story they mentioned about Rick Guerin. He was part of the original Buffett-Munger trio, right?
Yeah, the third partner, apparently just as smart as Buffett and Munger. But the difference, according to Warren, Guerin was in a hurry.
In a hurry.
How so? He used margin loans, heavily borrowing money to amplify his bets on stocks, and then bam, a market dip in the 70s, not even a massive crash, but enough to trigger margin calls. He was forced to sell his Berkshire Hathaway stock back to Buffett at like bargain basement prices right before it truly took off.
Ouch. So Warren and Charlie had the patience, the ability to withstand the dips, the skill of staying wealthy.
Precisely. It makes you think of that Nassim Taleb quote they include. Having an edge and surviving are two different things. The first requires the second. You need to avoid ruin at all costs. Ruin takes you out of the game permanently.
So the argument then becomes, maybe wanting to be financially unbreakable is actually more important, more powerful than just chasing the absolute highest returns.
Yes, because endurance, sticking around, that's the engine of compounding. And this requires cultivating what the source calls a barbelled personality.
A barbelled personality, what does that mean?
It means holding two seemingly opposite ideas in your head at the same time. On one hand, you need to be optimistic about the long-term future. You have to believe things will generally get better, otherwise why invest?
Right, makes sense.
But on the other hand, you need to be deeply, almost paranoid about all the unexpected things that could derail you, that could stop you from reaching that long-term future.
Like that long list they rattle off of completely unpredictable, awful historical events, world wars, depressions, pandemics, assassinations, things nobody saw coming.
Exactly. Those are grim reminders that focusing on survival, having a healthy dose of paranoia, it's not pessimism, it's realism. And sometimes the threats are just absurdly unpredictable.
Like the mice. Is that story really true?
The source presents it as true. This example about German tanks in World War II. Apparently, over 100 tanks were desperately needed on the Eastern Front. But when they went to deploy them from storage, fewer than 20 were actually operational.
Why? What happened?
Field mice.
Yeah.
They had apparently chewed through the insulation on the electrical wiring while the tanks were just sitting there. Sophisticated killing machines sidelined by mice.
That's incredible.
It is. But the point is, you can plan for the risks, you can foresee market downturns, maybe losing your job, but it's often the crazy, unforeseeable stuff, the mouse attacks, that can do the most damage because you haven't factored them in at all.
So having room for error, like keeping some cash savings, even if it feels like it's not working for you, that's your hedge against the unknown.
Exactly. It's the buffer that lets you endure the surprises, the shocks, the mice, whatever life throws at you, and stay in the game long enough for the good stuff, like compounding, to actually happen.
Okay, so given all this complexity, all this unpredictability, what does the source suggest is the best thing money can actually buy? Because it's probably not, a faster car or a bigger house based on what we've discussed.
No, it's something much more fundamental. The source makes a really compelling case that the highest form of wealth isn't stuff, it's control. It's the ability to wake up pretty much every morning and say, I can do whatever I want today.
Control over your time.
Control over your time. Deciding what you do, when you do it, who you spend it with, for how long. That's presented as the ultimate dividend money pays. And it lines up with research, too, like from Angus Campbell, showing this strong link between people's happiness and feeling like they're in control of their own lives.
I really liked that story about Derek Sivers, the musician founder. Saving, what was it, $12,000 when he was only making $20,000 a year?
Yeah, pretty extreme saving rate.
But he wasn't saving for a down payment or anything flashy. He explicitly said he was saving to buy back his freedom, to quit his job and have control over his time.
It's such a powerful contrast to the more common motivation, maybe, which is seeking wealth to gain admiration through possessions. The material introduces this great concept the man in the car paradox.
Right. Explain that again.
So when you see someone driving a really fancy car, like a Ferrari, you rarely think, wow, that driver must be such a cool, successful person.
Right. Yeah, probably not my first thought.
Usually you think something like, wow, if I had that car, I'd feel amazing and people would admire me. We use the car as a proxy for the admiration we desire for ourselves.
Interesting. So we want wealth, thinking it will bring respect.
But often the expensive things we buy to signal that wealth just make other people think about their own desires, not about admiring us. The source argues pretty strongly that things like humility, kindness, empathy, those are far more likely to earn you genuine respect than horsepower or square footage.
And this ties into another really key insight. True wealth is often what you don't see. It's an invisible.
Exactly right. There's that anecdote about someone working as a valet in LA. This guy named Roger always pulls up in a flashy Porsche. You just automatically assume, okay, this guy's loaded.
Sure.
Then one day, Roger shows up in a beat-up old Honda. Why? The Porsche got repossessed.
Oops.
It illustrates the point perfectly. We judge wealth based on what's visible, the car, the big house, the Instagram vacation photos, because that's literally the only information we have. But actual wealth is the money that hasn't been spent yet. It's the assets accumulating in the background, the financial potential that hasn't been converted into visible stuff.
There's that great quote from investor Bill Mann. Something like, there's no faster way to feel rich than spending lots of money.
But the way to be rich is to spend money you have and to not spend money you don't have.
Yeah, that's a good one.
But the source pushes it even further, doesn't it? It does. It basically says the only way to actually be wealthy is to not spend the money you do have. That unspent money, those accumulated financial assets. That is the definition of wealth. Spending proves you had money, maybe, but wealth is what remains.
They use that exercise analogy too, right?
Yeah, which I thought was clever. Being rich is like, you work out hard and then you reward yourself with a big treat. You earned it, feels good. Being wealthy is skipping the treat. It's actually burning net calories. It requires that self-control, that delayed gratification. It's about creating and maintaining that gap between your income and your spending. That gap, that's where wealth actually grows.
And it's so hard to find wealthy role models because, well, by definition, wealth is hidden. Yeah. That story of Ronald Read, the janitor and gas station attendant who lived super frugally.
And secretly amassed an $8 million fortune.
Yeah, he only became this famous role model for saving after he died and people found out. Yeah. It really highlights how hard it is to learn from something you literally cannot see.
Which brings it all back to the savings rate. The source argues pretty persuasively that your savings rate actually matters more than your income level or even your fancy investment returns over time. Because wealth is just the accumulated leftovers.
Leftovers. Simple as that.
Simple as that. Being efficient with your money, doing more with what you have, like that example of U.S. energy efficiency improving dramatically even as the economy grew, that's incredibly powerful. And saving specifically for the unexpected, for life's curveballs, for the surprises, that's presented as maybe the most crucial reason to save.
Because the value of wealth isn't just buying things.
No, it's relative to your needs.
Right.
And the biggest, often overlooked value is the flexibility, the options, the control over your time that it provides. That's almost incalculable.
So, okay, stepping back a bit. This material constantly reminds us we aren't spreadsheets. We're not purely rational robots optimizing every decision.
Not even close.
We're emotional, complex, sometimes messy human beings. And because of that, maybe aiming to just be mostly reasonable in our financial lives is actually more effective, more sustainable than striving for cold, hard rationality all the time.
I think that's a key takeaway. That analogy they use about treating a fever really makes the point well. Scientifically, a fever might have benefits helping your body fight infection.
Right. You hear that sometimes.
But it feels awful. So what do people do universally? They take medicine to pour the fever down, to feel better. The doctor recommending Tylenol isn't being irrational, they're being reasonable. They're balancing the theoretical science with the patient's actual comfort and tolerance.
That's a great analogy.
Or think about Harry Markowitz, Nobel Prize winner, basically the father of modern portfolio theory.
Yeah, the guy who figured out diversification mathematically.
Exactly. So how did he invest his own money? Not with some hyper-complex, perfectly optimized, rational formula derived from his own work. Nope. He just split it 50-50 between stocks and bonds.
Really?
His reasoning: to minimize future regret. He knew he'd feel terrible if the market soared and he wasn't participating enough, but he'd also feel awful if it crashed and he was too exposed. So 50-50 felt reasonable, emotionally comfortable. It shows investing isn't just math. It involves our feelings, our personalities.
Well, this leads to another really important point the source highlights.
Yeah.
This danger of viewing historians as prophets. History is crucial, absolutely. It helps calibrate our expectations, shows us the range of what's possible, gives us a guide, a baseline.
But it is definitely not a map of the future, especially not in finance, which is constantly changing because of innovation and, crucially, because of unpredictable human behavior. It's not like geology, right, where the past tells you exactly how rocks will behave.
Precisely. Finance is a system driven by millions of people making decisions, often based on emotion, incomplete information, and changing narratives. And the source points out the biggest economic events, the real game changers, are often precisely the things nobody saw coming, the true surprises. Plus, things change structurally. Like the source mentions the rise of 401ks, or how recessions seem to behave differently now than they did 50 years ago. That means past data isn't always directly applicable.
Right. Even classic strategies like Ben Graham's original value investing formulas, brilliant for their time, they might not work the same way today, partly because too many people learned them. That knowledge changed the game itself.
Which just reinforces, again, the absolute necessity of having room for error. Because, like those mice in the tanks,
Yeah.
the truly unpredictable will happen.
And that's why leverage using debt is so dangerous. It takes routine, manageable risks, a market dip, a temporary job loss, and turns them into potentially ruinous risks. Risks that can knock you out of the game entirely.
Like homeowners underwater in 2008 who couldn't take advantage of low rates later, or obviously Lehman Brothers just ceasing to exist. Leverage removes your margin for error.
Exactly. It makes you fragile right when you need to be resilient. The most dangerous risks are often the ones that seem too crazy to even cross your mind.
And finally, the source makes this really powerful point about stories versus statistics.
Oh, yeah, the narrative aspect.
Use that alien example again. An alien observing New York City in, say, mid-2007 versus early 2009.
Right. The alien sees basically the same tangible reality, right? Same buildings, same number of people, roughly the same infrastructure, same traffic.
Looks pretty similar from space.
Looks very similar, but between those 2 points, the narrative about the economy, the story people were telling themselves and each other had completely collapsed. And that collapse in the story, in confidence, caused immense real-world damage, even though the physical city was largely unchanged.
So stories can be more powerful than the underlying facts sometimes.
Often, especially in finance, where the stakes are high, information is imperfect, and we all have this deep-seated desire to believe narratives that make sense or sound appealing. It explains why people listen to forecasters who are consistently wrong, or why they pour money into investment funds that reliably underperform their benchmarks. The source notes a huge percentage do, yet trillions stay invested. Or how someone like Madoff can pull off what he did for so long. The story was compelling.
And then hindsight bias kicks in.
Oh, massively. After something happens, it always feels like it was obvious, predictable. Of course the housing market crashed. Of course that company failed.
Yeah, we all do that.
We do. But that feeling creates this illusion of control, this illusion that the world is more understandable and predictable than it really is. And that misunderstanding makes us vulnerable to making poor decisions, maybe following others, those aliens, seeing a different narrative, because we don't truly grasp the complex, often random forces at play.
Wow. Okay, we have covered a ton of ground in this deep dive. We've gone from how our unique personal experiences shape everything about how we see money to the slippery concept of enough, the incredible power but slow burn of compounding and saving, and the fact that real wealth is often invisible.
Right.
We've talked about why being reasonable might beat being rational, the dangers of prediction, the need for room for error, and even dipped into the history behind why Americans spend the way they do.
And I think woven through all of that is this core message from the material.
Yeah.
Really understanding the human side of money, the psychology, the emotions, the biases. It isn't some soft secondary thing. It's just as important, maybe even more important, than understanding the spreadsheets and the financial products.
Because it explains so much of the seemingly irrational behavior we see.
Including our own, yeah. And it highlights why these non-financial qualities, things like patience, flexibility, humility, knowing yourself, having control over your time, why those are actually crucial for navigating your financial life successfully over the long haul.
So wrapping this up, what does this all mean for you, the listener? As you reflect on this deep dive, maybe take a moment to consider your own personal history with money. How have the specific experiences you've had, good or bad, really shaped the way you view risk or saving or spending today?
Yeah, and ask yourself, Are you primarily chasing wealth for the freedom and control it can offer, that ability to dictate your own time? Or maybe, if you're honest, are you finding yourself drawn more towards richness, the visible stuff, hoping for perceived admiration from others? There's no judgment, just self-awareness.
And think about that end of history illusion the source mentions. This idea that we tend to think we basically become the person we're going to be, but in reality, our goals or desires or priorities will likely change significantly over time.
Right. So, knowing that your future self might want different things, how can you build balance and flexibility in that all important room for error into your financial life today? How can you give that future version of you the best chance to adapt and pivot without ending up trapped or filled with regret?
Lots to think about. That's it for this deep dive. We really hope this exploration of the psychology of money gives you plenty to consider as you continue on your own financial journey.